Hello, everyone, and welcome to this edition of the Archaeological Sciences interview series, sponsored by the Society for Archaeological Sciences, also known as SAS or SAS. My name is Rachel Johnson, and I'm a PhD candidate at Tulane University. And today I'm excited to introduce our special guest, Dr. Brandi MacDonald. Dr. MacDonald is an assistant research professor in the Archaeometry Laboratory at the Missouri University Research Reactor, more commonly known as MURR. And she's also a board member of the Society for Archaeological Sciences. So thank you, Brandi, for being with us today. I really appreciate your taking the time to talk to us.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, fantastic. So I guess I wanted to start off with a more broad question. Based on your own research description on the MURR website, you've said that your research has focused extensively on multi-analytical approaches to the study of pigments, rock art, obsidian, and ceramics. And much of your research utilizes instrumental neutron activation and other forms of geochemical analysis like LAICPMS and X-ray diffraction. So I'm curious a little bit about your personal journey into academia. What drew you specifically to the archaeological sciences?
That's a great question. I think a lot of people who come to find themselves working in archaeological science reflect on that a lot, particularly those of us who've been trained in North America, where there aren't really very many dedicated programs in archaeological science. So like many others, I had to kind of forge a bit of a unique and sometimes meandering path through my academic training. And so I was really lucky as an undergraduate to have a research assistant position in the nuclear reactor at McMaster University, where I did my training, pre-doctoral training. And at the time in my studies, I was majoring in archaeology, but I was also taking a lot of courses in geology, earth sciences. And so I started to get really interested in mineralogy, rocks, minerals, earth formation processes, sedimentology. And while I was also simultaneously learning about archaeology, I just kept seeing all of these possibilities for bridging these bodies of knowledge. And it wasn't sort of just that on my own. There are also some amazing archaeological science and geoarchaeology practitioners at McMaster University, particularly some geochemists who pioneered things like stable isotope analysis, different geochronological methods, and so on. And so I was really fortunate to be able to work with folks who kind of understood that sort of interdisciplinary work and be sort of encouraged and nurtured and sort of mentored by them. So yeah, it was sort of a meandering path for several years. I ended up as a research associate in the physics department, where I found myself teaching undergraduates in physics how to take X-rays of paintings, for instance, and how to do pigment analysis in sort of museum collections using non-destructive methods. So really getting physics students to think outside of the box in terms of what the techniques they were learning how to use can do outside of sort of pure physics. And so, yeah, it was a really, interesting journey. And without that, I certainly wouldn't have the job that I have now without that kind of training. So
yeah, no, I mean, interestingly enough, actually, I myself have an undergraduate degree in geology as well as anthropology. So it's interesting to see, some of those parallels. And I mean, I'm also very interested in a lot of the same research topics. But in terms of your meandering path, there's actually, you're saying you're teaching physics students about how to X-ray art. And one thing I noticed on your academia.edu page is that you're also, you have an association with the McMaster Museum of Art as a special projects curator. So I'm curious, how would you say that your experience working with museums and museum collections has also impacted your work as an archaeological scientist?
that's a great question. I think one of the sort of most common themes that I've encountered in doing interdisciplinary work is that, say you have an idea where you want to analyze some particular form of material culture, cultural heritage, and you want to use a technique in physics or chemistry. And so you go to a chemist or a physicist and say, hey, I need to understand these particular properties of this material. For those folks who have not had the chance to work with heritage materials, it takes a lot of back and forth communication to understand, like, you can't destroy things, you have to do it non-destructively, you can't take things apart. Often scientific instrumentation is often built to like take tiny little samples of things and stick them in a chamber that's like only this big, which, you know, then excludes so much material culture from being able to analyze, right?
Yeah.
So I found that getting the opportunity to work with museum collections through the McMaster Museum of Art on a few different special projects really helped me practice learning that sort of language and learning how to have those conversations in those collaborative relationships with scientists, to sort of make sure that that communication is good and like we're both on the same page about what can and can't be done with these materials and the complexity of anthropogenic materials as well.
Yeah, no, I think those are some really great points, especially, you know, I know working with museums from personal experience is its own can of worms at times. And there's certainly, you know, there's a lot that goes into collections management and, you know, getting permission for destructive material, like destructive analysis of archaeological materials. So I think that's something that absolutely archaeologists should be very aware of when doing analyses themselves. So my next question for you is, you know, you've talked about, you know, teaching students and physics students about different techniques in analytical sciences. But I'm curious, you know, if you had any advice that you could give to undergraduate students who are interested in becoming archaeological scientists themselves, what kind of advice you would have to offer them?
It's a good question, and I get asked this a lot. And I think seeking out mentorship in many different places is really important. Doing good archaeological science is inherently a collaborative endeavor. And so being able to communicate and talk with people across different disciplines is a really important skill that you will always be sort of developing and using in your career. And I would also say, you know, most archaeological scientists are like generally really nice, nerdy people who love talking about cool ideas and different methods. And so like, just reach out to people, talk to people, say you read a paper that you really enjoyed, send the author a note and say, hey, this was really cool and interesting. And, you know, I find because we don't get to come together in person a lot, especially these days with conferences, there's even the disconnect that already exists in academic communication and publishing is exacerbated even more. And so I think, you know, ask questions, be curious, talk to people generally, and try to do internships. That was something that I benefited greatly from in my training, was getting to learn with different people and getting experience in different labs. And so, you know, now I'm sort of running a pre-doctoral internship program at MUR. And I mean, what I'm seeing with the students who come through, they learn so much being exposed to all of these different projects. They get really inspired. They get all these new and exciting ideas for their research and have a better understanding of the possibilities and the limitations of archaeological science. And I think, yeah, my advice is try to get into some labs and really talk to archaeological scientists.
Yeah. I will say, you know, from personal experience, one of the great things about just to plug being in the Society for Archaeological Sciences, especially as the student ambassador, is all of these connections that I've been making, you know, with you and other members of the board, and you know, especially people that have so much experience in, you know, the kinds of research and the research questions that I myself am very interested in. Just as an extension of this question, would your advice be any different for students who are maybe a little further along in the process, say, you know, early career scholars who are perhaps towards the end of a PhD program or recently finished with their dissertation research?
No, I don't know how different my advice would be. I mean, of course, the context of experience would be different if you're sort of in the training mode or if you're in sort of career building mode. I think be open to collaborations. You know, I think there's a lot of, because there isn't traditional training in archaeological science in North America at very many institutions, I think really just reaching out to people and talking about project ideas and like learning truly about how complex and challenging archaeological science can be, and having truly collaborative partnerships with the people who are experts. This is sort of
Mhm.
one of my labs. This is like my lab. This is one of the main reasons we exist, is to support and collaborate with other people for their research. And so I think, yeah, just learning more about the methods is really important.
Mhm. And I will say, in terms of, you know, um, you've been at MUR for a few years now, and you're now running this predoctoral fellowship program. Um, and I think, this is also reflected in your own publication record, in terms of your collaborations, because in looking through a lot of your publications, I would say, your research truly is, quite broad. You've done a lot of work on pigments and resource procurement and compositional analysis of different types of artifacts, including both obsidian and ceramics. But a lot of your more recent publications have focused specifically on ochre, both in terms of source characterization and identifying procurement patterns and potential evidence of trade, which, from my more cursory knowledge of ochre, I had assumed, would be quite difficult, in my geological knowledge, just knowing that ochre is one of those materials that can be very heterogeneous in composition. So I guess in terms of a broader question about some of your work on this topic of ochre, what do you think are some of the most interesting conclusions of your work thus far? And are there any questions that you really hope that, or archaeological questions that you hope that your work will be able to address in the future?
Yeah, so I think there's two things that come to mind in terms of sort of my motivation and what I think is really interesting, particularly about ochre research is, I mean, ochre is a very red mineral pigment. Hominids used it for hundreds of thousands of years. It is just this like incredibly universal material that humans were always drawn to. And I think in contexts where we have deep time records and where we can really look into the deeper past and understand sort of the development and evolution of that in different areas of the world, I think is what really is something I'm quite motivated by. So like, our recent paper on underground ochre mining in the Yucatan
Mhm.
sort of really highlighted things like, we know that people were using ochre. We find residues of it, remnants of it in sort of anthropogenic archaeological contexts, but evidence for the actual like mining and prospection of it is quite rare. And
Mhm.
so, that particular context in these flooded caves that flooded over, 8,000 years ago, we have this like really interesting kind of time capsule where
Mhm.
the mining behavior, like it's literally just like as though they had just left and it flooded. So you still see digging tools, you still see where they're following actual like lenses of high purity hematite
Wow.
through these limestone interbedded formations. So like there's this cognitive understanding of mineral prospection that you can just see this clear evidence for, because they're like following deep underground into
Yeah.
these cave systems just to extract this raw material. And so I think that's also sort of a really interesting insight into, Paleolithic, Pleistocene, Ice Age cognitive thinking in various parts of the world. And so another example of this, sort of, you asked what my sort of motivation is in terms of ochre.
Mhm.
The other thing that I'm also quite interested in is relates to provenance
Mhm.
and a lot of the methods that I use in my lab. And so really just using ochre as a proxy for mobility
Mhm.
and understanding adaptations to sort of different types of environments. So especially again in these deep time records where you can see clear variations in where people were going to provision ochre, how that might have changed in terms of like how it coincided with changes in lithic technology, environmental change, resource change, habitat change, dietary change, settlement
Mhm.
pattern change. And so I think it's this really underutilized raw material for really finding other lines of evidence to talk
Mhm.
about mobility and social interaction too, because we do see ochre moving fairly long distances at times, and sort of intensification or dissipation of this movement signals something about social networks and possible changes in social dynamics. And so I think for many years, um, ochre has ochre research was really constrained by dominant theoretical thinking that ochre equals symbolism, therefore there's nothing more to know about it, right? It's sort of like,
Yeah.
oh yes, they painted with it, it was used ceremonially, used in mortuary practices, but I think there was sort of a limit in the creative thinking about that, or there was just an overemphasis on that. And
Yeah.
so I think, I'm not saying that that's not an important aspect of ochre use by any means, but I think there's actually more that we can learn, particularly using the tools and sort of the advancements in analytical techniques that we can use these days. So
Yeah, I mean, I think perhaps part of it, you've mentioned this in some of your own publication as well, that people for a long time have assumed that, perhaps ochre as a very, at times heterogeneous geological material, they just assumed that, it couldn't be necessarily sourced, with a lot of accuracy. But I think your own publications really disprove this. I know there's two that I came across that I found really interesting. One from the Great Lakes region, and I was looking through the analysis and I saw the cluster diagram and how well everything actually grouped together when you're actually doing the multivariate analytical statistics. And I was personally very impressed to see there's a lot of great potential, I think, for actually being able to do provenance studies with ochre as a raw material. So I'm
yeah,
just excited about that aspect.
thank you, I'm excited too. I think it's really regionally specific as
Mhm,
well, because there are areas where the geology is just not exactly very conducive to it.
mhm,
And so it's really, you have to have a really developed understanding of which raw materials are available
mhm,
within the vicinity. Um, you need to not only look at trace elements using sort of chemical techniques, but understanding petrofabrics, understanding
mhm.
formation processes. So when you're actually like looking at your material, you can tell by eye often, but not always, this should come from this particular type of
Mhm.
geologic formation. And so it's more than just like taking a rock and throwing it in a reactor. It
Yeah.
actually requires a lot more sort of knowledge about the region and iron oxides.
Oh, wow. Yeah. I think that's a great way to frame it. I think in general, archaeological sciences and the type of geochemical analysis that you do, it's more than throwing a rock or ceramic in the reactor. There's a lot of other information that you really have to plug in with it.
Mhm.
Um, so I guess in that, I think that leads me really well to my next question. So oftentimes, at MUR, at this lab, that you're actually collaborating with other researchers that are sending you raw materials and they're asking their own archaeological questions, and you're really helping them do a lot of the analytical process. So I guess, especially, I know even a lot of grad students in my own department are working with you for some of their projects. So I guess, is there anything that you wish people knew ahead of time as they're doing sample preparation that would help them, ease along this process of, doing,
Mm.
INAA or what have you?
Not necessarily knowing in advance, but I think reaching out and talking to people in the lab before you submit samples. So we have a sort of mini proposal program where you have to
Mhm,
send in at least a short proposal describing your project and what your aims are. I think one of the most common uh, pitfalls that we see are that archaeologists who aren't as experienced with archaeological science, particularly interpreting the data,
mhm,
whether it be through understanding the chemical compositions or the multivariate statistics that you need to understand, sampling strategy is the most common thing that we have to help people work with and say,
mhm.
okay, you have question A, B, and C, but you've chosen a sampling strategy that won't address questions B or C. It might address A, right?
Yeah.
So like an extreme example being like somebody says, I want to compare ceramic production between location A and location B, and I'm going to give you 50 samples from location A and 10 from location B. Well, that's not really, that's an
Not
extreme
really.
example, a very simplistic one, but I think that's really sampling strategy and understanding what constitutes evidence for provenance.
Mhm.
I think is an important dialogue to be constantly going back and forth on.
No, I think that's good. And also, great that we're doing this interview series so that, people know that they can do this mini proposal and get help with the sampling strategies that they need if they're at that point in their research process.
Yeah.
So I think we're getting towards the end of our interview here, but before we leave, there's two questions I have. The first one being, how did you get involved with the Society for Archaeological Sciences? And if you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit more about your position on the board as well.
Sure. I've been a long time member of the SAS as a graduate student. It always felt like there was this small community of people who understood what I was also
Fellow
interested
nerds.
in. Yeah, it was like, oh my gosh, there's another community of people out there. And so I really liked some of the programming and the awards, the poster awards, the recognition, and seeing the little logo like at the SAA conference
Mhm.
and stuff. I was like, these folks, I'm into it. I'm into what they're doing. And then a couple years ago, 3 years ago now, I saw a posting for somebody to replace an outgoing member on the board, which is a dual position. So I'm representing the SAS, mutually representing the journal Archaeometry with the SAS. So I'm kind of a liaison between the two. This is a long time arrangement between the SAS. We also have a board member who on the SAS who's involved with the Journal of Archaeological Science, for instance, because these are of course the two sort of publishing most top publishing areas in archaeological science internationally. And so basically I represent the interests of the SAS to Archaeometry and vice versa. And so also as part of that, I'm a managing editor at Archaeometry. So I intake manuscripts when they come in, assess them, determine if they are fit the right scope and level of integrity for the journal, and I select reviewers, send them out, manage the peer review process. It's all the way through to making a recommendation to the editor-in-chief. If I say, yeah, I think this paper would be great for the journal, I think we should publish it, then I make that recommendation. And it's just been an incredible experience, that aspect of it, because it's taught me a lot more about the peer review process and about how to frame responses to reviewers and things like that. And I share that with all of my graduate students too, like not specific manuscripts or anything, but like advice on how to improve your chances of getting a paper in archaeometry or JAS, right? And so it's been a really, really great learning experience for me, and I really like it. So, and helping to improve the journal's policies as well. I think sort of since I've been there, getting feedback from the SAS, getting feedback from the membership and the board, and sort of getting the journal to adopt more. They're doing transparent peer review, which is something that Wiley, the publisher, had started doing anyway, but also sort of author contribution statements. So making sure that people, especially early career faculty and students, are getting appropriately credited for their contributions to papers. And so I think that's just sort of improving the general lot of archaeological science publishing. So getting to really push some of those things through has been rewarding. So.
And as a graduate student, I will say greatly appreciate it as well. So thank you for all the hard work you've been doing on that. My last question is admittedly the cheesiest one of the bunch, which is, if you got, had all the grant money and all the time in the world, what project would you want to take on?
That's a great question. And I was sort of reflecting on that this morning, and it's going to sound equally cheesy, but I already have that,
Oh, well, that's
right
fantastic.
Now. Like I know it sounds so cheesy, but like right now I have two big projects that I'm working on. The Swatini project that we were talking about, so Stone Age ochre procurement in Swaziland. And then a second project that a colleague and I, Dr. Julian Huntley at Griffith University, recently received funding for. So it's working in Northern Australia in Kakadu National Park with the Mirarr traditional owners. So looking at some of the oldest ochre assemblages in Australia. And so I'm actually going there for the first time now that the travel bans have been lifted. I can finally get into Australia, because we've had this funding for a while now, haven't really been able to make progress on the project, but it's also just been like a dream project of mine, and we worked really hard to get funding and got it. And so yeah, dream projects. I feel like I'm so lucky to already be there.
No, that's fantastic. I think that's what every young scholar especially wants to hear and see, especially from other, young scholars who are, getting themselves very established in the field, that, you already have the dream job, which I think is all we can hope for in our careers.
Yeah, I'm very
So,
lucky. I get to collaborate with amazing people and get to work on projects that I'm interested in and see students and support students come through and learning. And so I'm very lucky.
yeah, well, I think the field of archaeological sciences is also very lucky to have you.
Well,
So I just wanted to say thank you so much for your time, Dr. MacDonald. I really have enjoyed chatting with you. And if you have any other questions, observers of this videos, please feel free to email me. My email will be in the description below, or Dr. MacDonald as well, and her email will also be in the description. Thank you, everyone.